In the 1950s, the Scottish government created 4 housing schemes on the outer edges of Glasgow: Easter House, Drumchapel, Castlemilk and Pollock. Each estate was designed to house 30 to 50,000 people, making them some of the largest social housing projects in the whole of Europe. It was a fresh start for hundreds of thousands of Scots, who previously were cramped into inner city slums, which were way beyond their expiration date. But these new estates came with new problems. Built on the far edges of Glasgow City, each scheme was built miles away from any schools, shops, jobs and entertainment. Families found themselves surrounded by fields and motorways, stranded in concrete towns with nowhere to go and nothing to do. For most, day-to-day life became a struggle, but for one business model it was a blessing: the ice cream van. In estates with no nearby shops, families came to rely on ice cream vans for much more than just cones and lollies. With growing demand, they branched out to selling groceries, cigarettes, alcohol, toys and sometimes even clothes. In the late 50s, ice cream vans became the only way many families without a car could buy groceries, and due to the convenience and limited competition, the first ice cream vans were bringing in massive profits, so much that many monopolized. People with successful vans bought more vans covering more areas, and very soon pretty much most schemes around Glasgow had ice cream vans servicing them throughout the day. But as the trade grew, so did the competition. And with new competition came new problems. In busy schemes, vans would make 2 to 3 scheduled runs a day, normally a morning, afternoon and evening run. But as new players came in the game, routes started to overlap and business started getting messy. Different vans from rival operators would arrive in the same schemes, often at the same time, all chasing the same customers. At first, it was just a case of trying to outdo the next van by getting the schemes quicker, blasting chimes louder, and maybe undercutting prices by a penny or two. But soon the stakes became clearer. A good run could be worth thousands of pounds a week, and nobody wanted to give up territory once they had it. What started as light-hearted rivalry turned into serious turf wars. Drivers were pressured to stay off certain streets. Vans were attacked by paid-off gangs of kids, who in some cases even set vans on fire. For the young street gangs living in the impoverished schemes, it wouldn't take much bribing from operators to scare off rivals, and there was no shortage of young kids available to do this. In the 1970s, Glasgow had one of the worst youth gang problems in all of Europe. 1 in 3 young men living in Glasgow schemes belonged to a gang, and with little hope of employment or success, violence became its own currency. Hundreds of youth gangs were active across the city, many in the big housing schemes. Every close, every street corner, every patch of waste ground could belong to a different team, and violence was just a part of daily life. By the 80s, Glasgow was officially the murder capital of Europe, and to the ice cream vans, this meant constant danger. If they strayed into the wrong patch or upset the wrong people, they risked being run off the roads for good. But soon, ice cream operators would have much more worries than little kids running around on the streets. The underworld began to see the ice cream trade for what it really was: a ready-made network of cash businesses, rolling into Glasgow's poorest housing schemes every single day with no disruption from the law. And for organized gangsters who grew up in these schemes, it was a perfect setup. They knew the streets, they knew the people, and they could easily control the business in their areas. Now legitimate ice cream vendors weren't only dealing with gangs of kids, they were up against hardened criminals, many of which had little intentions of selling ice cream. In the 80s, Glasgow was being ravaged by a heroin epidemic. Cheap brown heroin was flooding into the city, and the housing schemes were hit the hardest. In some areas, 1 in 10 young people were hooked, and for the dealers supplying the habit, ice cream vans became the most discreet way to run it. When drug vendors entered the game, business turned much more violent. The attacks on legitimate vans were so regular that many drivers and companies quit, but some refused to fold. One of these being the Marchetti family. The Marchettis had been in the trade since the start of the boom. part of Glasgow's Italian-Scottish community who had pioneered the city's love of ice cream. Unlike the gangsters muscling in, the Marchettis run a straight business, selling ice cream, sweets, groceries and cigarettes, and had over 40 vans all operating across Glasgow schemes. But many of Marchetti's routes clashed with rival illegitimate operators, which made them a target.
All the windows had been broken, the windscreens, the headlamps. There'd been no attempt to rob the vehicles, they'd just been attacked.
In one day, 3 of Marchetti's vans had been attacked, with one of the vans being drove by a young man named Andy Doyle. Andy specifically was a victim to regular attacks and threats, but every time he was challenged, he refused to give in. At one point, a shotgun was fired through the windscreen of his van, but Andy carried on running his route, defying the gangs who wanted him out, a decision which would lead to one of the most ruthless and heartless attacks in Glasgow's history.
The fire broke out early this morning and police believe it may have been started deliberately. Other families were evacuated from the building as firemen fought the blaze. Police and firemen are now trying to discover exactly how the fire started.
April 16th, 1984, Andy Doyle's house was firebombed. 6 members of Andy's family were killed in the blaze, including Andy himself and his 18-month-old nephew. The attack shocked Glasgow, and a lot of people had no doubts about who had done it. Ex-gangster Thomas Campbell. Campbell grew up in the neighbourhood right next to where the attack took place, and not too long before Marchetti's van started being attacked, he got into the ice cream business and operated the same routes which Marchetti vans controlled. Campbell also had a very violent past. Growing up, he was the leader of the Gaucho gang, one of the city's most notorious street gangs, and soon police would receive intel on Campbell from an unlikely place. Inside Barlini prison, a petty criminal named William Love tells detectives he knows Campbell was involved. While in a Glasgow pub, William Love overheard Thomas Campbell and others talking about setting fire to Doyle's home, which for detectives was enough to arrest him on charges of the murder. Campbell wasn't the only one to be arrested though. 5 others were also apprehended, all of which had close ties with Campbell, one of them being a man named Joseph Still. The trial of the 6 men was heavily publicised.
18-year-old Andrew Doyle had been a van driver with the Glasgow Ice Cream company Marchetti brothers.
Vicious gangsterism aimed at controlling a major sector of the city's
A total of 7 men were in the dock at the High Court in Glasgow.
Throughout the trial, every man accused maintained their innocence, and the case nearly fully collapsed after one eyewitness retracts his statement, claiming he was bullied into a confession. This retraction collapsed the case on 4 of the accused. But for Thomas Campbell and Joe Still, the pressure was still on. Thomas Campbell's case still had the weight of William Love's confession, and several officers wrote statements claiming that Joe Still confessed to the murders on arrest. And for that reason, both Joseph Still and Thomas Campbell was convicted and sentenced to a minimum term of 20 years in prison.
At 2:30 this afternoon, after more than 7 hours of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom with its verdicts.
2 men have been sentenced to life imprisonment for murdering a family of 6 in what became known as Glasgow's Ice Cream War.
The ringleader, Thomas Campbell, or TC as he was known, winced as the jury foreman announced the unanimous verdict, guilty of murder. The others remained emotionless as their verdicts were read out.
But this is where the story gets interesting. Despite both men being tried and convicted for the Doyle murders, they continued to plead their innocence. Campbell went on a hunger strike, refusing to eat any prison food, but still had a much more creative way to gain publicity for his innocence. On the 14th of August 1989, Joe Still was permitted a home visit to see his ill mother. He was accompanied by a prison guard, but as he enters his house, he closes the door and climbs up to the roof. He stays there for 3 hours screaming his innocence, creating a massive ruckus, which saw news crews and locals from the scheme flood the streets. The stunt was a success. Shortly after, the media decided to interview his mother, who tells the nation her son is innocent.
But I'll just ask you just about where Joseph was and how you know he couldn't possibly have done it, you know? How can you be so certain that your son had absolutely no involvement in any part of this?
Because I was in the house along with him. And I know for a fact that I never went to my bed till 3 o'clock in the morning, and he never went outside that door, and I swear it.
And a few years after all of this, an old witness pops back up and tells the nation something that turns the tide on the case. In 1992, a book titled The Frightener was released, written by Douglas Skeleton. The book exposed massive flaws in the trial, including the fact that there was no petrol traces, fingerprints, or eyewitnesses placing Campbell was still at the scene, and that the conviction was based solely on the fact that one man locked in jail overheard a conversation. And to put the final nail in the coffin, that exact witness, William Love, featured in the book and states he was pressured by police to fabricate the testimony. The book gave Campbell and Steele's campaign a huge boost. To build momentum, Campbell began recording videos in his prison cell on a smuggled camcorder. His pleas of innocence hit national news, and soon so would something else. In Sawton Prison, where Steele was serving his sentence, every 3 months prisoners will be released for 4 hours to visit their family. Steele saw this as an opportunity. One day when he was released, he broke free and fled to London. While on the run, he calls into a news station and draws further attention to his case. And afterwards, he surrenders himself to the police in the most publicized way he could.
31-year-old Steele escaped from a prison escort in Glasgow earlier this week. Late this afternoon, he used handcuffs to attach himself to the railings of the palace.
Steele handcuffed himself to the gates of Buckingham Palace, a move that doesn't just make Scottish news, but English news. And this wouldn't be his last done. A week later, he was back in and out of jail, escaping from Sawton Prison days after arriving. In this escape, he ran to a remote Scottish island and invited a documentary crew to film him. The documentary put him in the public eye once again, but what he did after attracted even more attention.
The convicted killer, Joseph Steele, is staging a protest outside Glasgow's Barlinnie prison.
I'm here to draw attention to the miscarriage of justice for myself and Tommy Campbell. We've been wrongfully convicted now for 10 years, and nobody's done nothing about it.
In another stunt, Steele scaled the walls of Barlinnie prison in a last-ditch attempt to make the news before being locked back up. By this point, Steele's antics split public opinion. Many people believe Steele's persistence of innocence was telling, and so did the police. In 1996, both men's cases won their appeal, so both were subsequently released on bail pending a new trial. But the retrial didn't go well. Despite William Love retracting his statement, the prosecutor still had the evidence from when Campbell and Steele admitted to their murders to police officers, and for that reason their permanent release was rejected, and they were sent back to prison to finish off their sentences. For years the case went quiet, until the Scottish legal system underwent a massive law reform. In 1999, the Scottish Criminal Cases Review Commission was established, who began looking into past cases, including the trial of Steele and Campbell. In their cases, the commission found several major red flags, including the statements from police officers. It was found that 4 different officers wrote word by word the exact statements they heard from the convicted men, which is highly unlikely unless all officers planned what they were going to write beforehand. And when officers were brought to tell their side of the story, they admit that they didn't even write those statements, that they were just told to sign it. And now with the statements being withdrawn by the police, to everyone, including the courts, it was clear. All evidence and statements were fabricated, resulting in their eventual release in 2004, 20 years after they were initially locked up. Still to this day, no one really knows who set the Doyle's house on fire. Many still believe Thomas Campbell done it, but many also believe it was a man named Tam McGraw, a Scottish career criminal who also owned vans, and also operated in the same area as Andy Doyle, and also was initially arrested for the murder, but quietly released, due to what most of Glasgow's underworld believe is due to him being a police informant.